Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Liam Rātana tēnei. Kia ora, it's Liam. Just a small update. Since recording this podcast, Te Māngai Pāho has released its final funding decision for the 25-26 News and Current Affairs round. Te Karere, which is discussed at length in this episode, has received $1 million worth of funding. Whakaata Māori has now been named as the National News Hub provider and received $1.5 million in funding. And TVNZ current affairs show Marae will be at least 80% Te Reo Māori and has also received $1.5 million in funding. So all these funding decisions are subject to final negotiations between Te Māngai Pāho and the applicants. But just a small update since filming this podcast. Kia ora.
Nau mai, hoki mai, kia the fold, e mihi nei, ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. I'm joined by my colleague Liam Rātana today. He's the editor of the Spinoff Ātea, and he's here to discuss a piece he wrote last week about some fairly seismic changes to the Māori media landscape. Two iconic shows, one of which has been on the air for more than 40 years, were both turned down for funding in the most recent Te Māngai Pāho round. TMP exists to, and this is a quote from the website, to fund media and content to promote Māori language and culture. So, you know, its core business is exactly the kind of thing that those shows, Te Karere and The Hui, do. But the changing nature of the way that audiences interact with content and the kinds of content they want, you know, it comes at us fast, and it comes at Māori audiences faster because they're a much younger demographic. So, we're going to sort of dig into those decisions and use those as a bit of a jumping off point for a wider look at the sector, the kind of key players in it, and you know the sort of forces behind that, because there's a fiscal cliff, a familiar phrase involved, and there are sort of, along with the audience preferences, there are these sort of crown preferences that you see within state-funded media that particularly push it towards audio and video outputs. So, yeah, really looking forward to this conversation. Liam's super plugged in on this stuff. He's a multi-time Fold guest, and it's great to have him back. Tēnā koe, Liam. Welcome to the Fold.
Kia ora, Duncan. Thank you.
I wonder if you could start with just a bit of a table setter, like top line, the Māori media sector, the key players across the funding and the platforms, and how those sort of forces give it a different kind of feel to the balance of the state and commercial sector.
Yeah, so at the top, we've got the Ministry for Māori Development. So Tama Pōtaka is the minister there. And they basically fund Te Māngai Pāho, which is the Māori Broadcast Funding Agency. And then we've got Whakaata Māori, Māori Television Service. And basically they both have a remit to promote the Māori language and culture. Then we've also got New Zealand On Air, which is obviously anyone can apply for funding from them, General Content Funding Agency. And its remit is not Māori specific, but still many Māori media producers obtain NZ On Air funding for things like scripted, non-fiction and digital content. And then in terms of platforms, we've obviously got Whakaata Māori, which I've touched on. They have their own studios based in Mount Wellington and employ around 150 full-time staff, commission productions, has its own news service, Te Ao News as well. Then we've got the iwi radio network, which is quite a big player in here. They're funded from Te Māngai Pāho. So there's a network of 21 iwi operated radio stations, which operate typically in bilingual English and Māori. And they're run across many iwi, hapu, and then we've got urban stations as well. I think they have to broadcast something like 8 hours of Te Reo Māori in a 24-hour block. And then sort of stemming from those iwi radio networks, there are currently 4 regional news providers, and they're regional, so they're not iwi specific, so they cover multiple iwi within a certain area. For example, we've got Tahu News, which does all of the South Island. Then there's Okaha, which does all of the Central North Island, for example. And then we've got the likes of the state-owned players, so TVNZ, RNZ, which do as well hold their own significant place in the Māori media sector or news landscape. We've seen a lot of the greats of Māori broadcasting and Māori news and media go through these outlets over time. And then we've got a bunch of Māori digital content and production companies and projects, the likes of Pango Productions, for example, who produce current affairs shows like Marae. We've got companies who are doing Māori language dubbing of Disney films like Matiwa Media, for example. So that sort of shows the sector's reach into niche areas. Where it differs with mainstream and commercial is one with Te Māngai Pāho and Whakaata Māori both having that explicit remit to contribute to the Māori language, revitalisation and promotion. So that sort of sets them, apart from the pack straight away. The bilingual aspect, Māori, English, and that cultural orientation. So they have to serve both real Māori speakers and Māori audiences and broader audiences who are generally interested in Māori culture. So they have to balance these sort of dual objectives of speaking to their Māori to language speakers and engaging wider audiences for sustainability. And then if we look at mainstream media, they typically serve mass market audiences solely in English, and their content is less often designed for language revitalization or like culturally specific things. With the funding, a lot of the funding that Māori media gets is reliant on contestable funding, which means there's a high level of competition between platforms and content producers for a very tight pool of funding. And then Whakaata Māori, they get their money directly from the Crown, and they also contest for funding as well, which has angered some people or made some people question why is Whakaata Māori getting funding directly from the government and also able to contest this pool over here.
Similar complaint that you see with RNZ, right? That has direct funding and then goes and fishes
exactly
elsewhere as well.
Yeah. And so the other thing is that with the sort of culturally targeted public funding base, there is some commercial for digital revenue potential and commercial potential, but because these outlets operate often at a much smaller scale than their mainstream competitors, they have tighter margins, more vulnerable to funding shifts, etc. So just recently, and I'm sure we're going to get into it, we've seen some funding cuts that have been reshaping the Māori news media and Māori media in general. We've got long-running current affairs shows like The Hui, Te Karere, the Daily News Bulletin. They've had their funding withdrawn, though it's important to note that Te Karere has been invited to reapply. And we've also seen funding for Whakaata Māori go down to 42 mil for this financial year as well. So while the mainstream commercial sector benefits from large advertising markets and the state media draws from a bigger pool of funding, Māori media has this unique resource pressure and also some unique opportunities with cultural branding and language niches and that sort of stuff, but at a much smaller scale. So this recent decision by Te Māngai Pāho to reshape current affairs funding is sort of signalling that there's going to be a shift which will force some long-standing shows to evolve or be left behind, which we've seen with, like Marae has been talking about becoming just the reo only, for example. So yeah, that's an example of sort of the direction that we're heading in and some of the constraints, I guess, that Māori media are facing at the moment.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Even just hearing you talk through, that the sector there, you do sense that there are these kind of sort of central kind of, that there are structural parts of it that have been not unchanged, but have got a lot of continuity to them. And when you think about those two shows in particular that were the sort of centerpiece of your reporting last week, I mean, Te Karere in particular, but also the Hui between them, that's 50 years of broadcasting, and two of the kind of more high profile or kind of most important pieces of effectively infrastructure within the sector. What was the kind of reaction within Māori media or just Te Ao Māori more broadly when that news kind of broke that they had missed out on funding, with the caveat around Te Karere notwithstanding?
For those that haven't been paying close attention to the industry, it probably came as a bit of a surprise, especially Te Karere as it stands, losing its funding. Over at least the last 3 years, Te Māngai Pāho has been indicating that there's going to be a preference for digital first media, shows, content, and Te Karere has basically stayed strictly a linear first news bulletin with a man behind a desk and reporters out in the regions, and those reporters are there by themselves. They shoot, cut, produce, all of their own stuff. But none of it, or very little of it, gets uploaded to socials and all that sort of stuff. So it sort of didn't come as a massive surprise that a linear show like that, as it stands, is going to have its funding cut. With the Hui, we've seen it's been trying to shift towards a digital first, well, not a digital first, but having a digital presence. But again, it still holds very strong in terms of its linear sort of appearance and production. It's made for television effectively, with a sort of a few tag-ons for socials and things like that, cut downs and that, but it hasn't had or undergone a great transformation to be a digital first product over the recent times.
Thinking about the balance of what Te Māngai Pāho funds, like of the more digital first productions, like has the news and current affairs space gotten more dynamic? Have they gone down a creator route, or are there sort of examples of kind of whether it's productions or shows that kind of feel like lights for where Te Karere in particular could kind of shift if it wanted to, effectively be more digital first versus that kind of more strictly kind of heritage linear approach that it sounds like it had kind of probably dragged its feet over at least giving up or evolving from?
Mm. Yeah, so those regional news providers that I mentioned before, they've sort of come about in the last few years. I think they were first funded in, I want to say, 2022. And although they've been quite resource light or infrastructure light, they've done a really good job at having a digital first presence. And just a small example was a story I covered, picked up on the back of some coverage that Ōkaha News did about Eileen Tamati, a kuia who appeared on the Hobson's Pledge billboard. That story was broken by Ōkaha News. They basically were at her house with a phone and a gimbal in her face, uploaded it straight to socials. It went viral. We picked that up, and it went, all over.
A huge story.
It was huge. And that was just a very small example of a digital first news story going viral straight away, and showed sort of the value of not only having a digital first presence, but also being in the regions and being able to respond quite quickly. And that's just a small example. We've seen some.
It's also a mentality though, right? Like that this thing just needs to have as few barriers from, the sort of foundational pieces of the story going to the audience, which, that is kind of pure digital first mentality, but it's quite hard to get any kind of scale newsroom to adopt that mentality.
Yeah, I think speaking to some people in the industry, they say that TVNZ, like you said, has been dragging its feet over this for some time.
I mean, it's notoriously 6 p.m. focused with its, the mainstream bulletin as well.
Yeah, and they could have been leading the industry with the amount of resources and infrastructure they have. They really could have been ahead of the curve, so to speak. But instead, we've seen these really small-scale regional providers come in, and they have people leading them that have that experience at the likes of TVNZ and Whakaata Māori who have produced those news bulletins. But now they've got that ability to just be really responsive to what's going on. They understand that it's a digital first world that we're living in. They've removed a lot of those barriers for people to be able to just go out, shoot something, upload it as it is. And they know that that's how you sort of lead the way now. Again, TVNZ and Te Karere, for example, have not really shifted in that way. They've stuck with the bulletin. They've stuck with produced reporting and, a camera, a microphone, a person cutting their stuff down and putting it out at 4 o'clock that day. And it's just not really working for them. There's still an audience there, but it's small, it's aging. And their audience is quite a lot older and people who stick with linear, but we know that that's not where the audiences are anymore.
And I kind of want to dig into the audiences piece in a bit, but do you want to talk about the Hui? Because if the Te Karere has a semblance of a lifeline, the Hui felt like one of the biggest current affairs shows on any media for a while there, even though that kind of sense has kind of maybe come back a bit lately. But that does feel like a loss, and according to what you're saying, it's the path back isn't so clear for them from this. What's the status there?
So I understand that they've still got some NZ on air funding that will keep them sort of afloat for now. They're looking at having to reduce the quantity of shows that they produce, basically slashing them in half at the moment. So that NZ on air funding will keep them going, but with Te Māngai Pāho, what I've been told is that because Te Māngai Pāho has firstly split its current affairs funding into reo only, like fluent audiences, and then receptive audiences, it chose not to fund actually any of the receptive pitches at this point in time because they just saw that there were too many shows that already served or filled that gap. We had Marae, we had The Hui, and then we had Te Ao with Moana, and they all were basically, I don't want to say doing the same thing, but serving the same purpose, in effect. And with massive funding cuts at Te Māngai Pāho, they just couldn't afford to keep funding 3 shows that were pretty much, filling the same sort of gap. And The Hui unfortunately missed out. Can't say whether it was because of their lack of collaboration or of a digital first strategy or things like that, but basically they were one of the ones that didn't get funded.
Historically it was part of the sort of had the news hub infrastructure around it. Stories often ran at 6 p.m. Like that. It had the world that surrounded it has changed a bit. So you alluded before to this sort of fiscal cliff, which is kind of sitting behind it all, because there's sort of 2 tensions acting on it, right? One is Te Māngai Pāho wanting to pull providers to where audiences are in that more digital space, but there's also like a shrinking funding envelope behind them that means that it's almost kind of forcibly accelerating that process. Do you want to just explain what's going on there?
Yeah, so basically, under the previous government, I think it was in 2022, the Ngāia Mahusa gave Te Māngai Pāho a bunch of time-bound or time-limited funding to go out and do a bunch of things. So we saw the Tirito cadetships set up. We saw the establishment of these regional news providers who then got some additional funding to keep them going. And when this new government came in, basically the funding dried up and there was going to be no additional funding put on top. And
sort of analogous to the Public Interest Journalism Fund, which I think debuted about the same time, was also connected to Tirito. So there was this kind of bomb of let's fund journalism, and this new government comes in and goes, let's get rid of all that, and the flow-on consequences are coming through, right? But it feels more pointed within Māori media because that was such a big proportion of the overall pie.
And the other problem is that in the background, the amount of baseline funding that Te Māngai Pāho has been receiving has only gone up something like 7 million over the last...
It was 8 years?
8 years, I think. And so it really struggled to keep up with inflation and the purchase power of of that baseline funding has greatly decreased over that time. So not only are they seeing all that massive drop of time-bound funding drying up, but also no increase in baseline funding, and production costs continue to increase, inflation, etc. So that's basically led to this fiscal cliff that we keep talking about. Coinciding with that is this genuine desire to support digital-first content. When the industry became aware that we were going to see this drying up of all this money, a working group was set up that had industry representatives, people from TVNZ, RNZ, independent producers, and representatives of the Māori Journalists Association, Kawea Te Rongo Ngā Aho Whakaari, which is the Māori in Screen Association network. And they basically came up with this plan, or their recommendation to Te Māngai Pāho, about how we could see some sort of continuity or how we could keep things going, given the circumstances with the reduced funding and this preference for a digital transformation that was long overdue. And so that working group came up with an outline that it provided to Te Māngai Pāho, which has actually helped inform this new approach that we're seeing with news and current affairs. And so for them, it's not just about digital transformation or evolving to meet the reduced funding, but also, again, this concept of giving some sort of rangatiratanga or mana motuhake to news producers in the regions. And they see this, as I understand it, as quite a transformative approach to Māori media. They're calling it the most drastic change we've had in 40 years of Māori news and Māori content, to give power or empower these regional providers that we're seeing out there. So we'll get into the regional stuff soon, I'm sure, but basically that group came up with this advice and said this is the path forward for Te Māngai Pāho with where we're at now. And Te Māngai Pāho has taken that and effectively agreed to it. So there's been that co-design approach, and that's where we're at now. And unfortunately, we're going to see, some shows either have to evolve to keep up or be left behind. And that's not going to please everybody, but it's unfortunately quite a necessary step to take to get to where the industry wants to be.
I mean, in some ways, what you're describing sounds like if you were to design Te Karere in 2025, more decentralized, more regional storytelling, perhaps not packaged up into a central bulletin, but kind of going out on those channels. Like it might sound something like this. Am I right in kind of thinking that potentially?
Yeah, I think what Te Māngai Pāho is trying to say to the likes of TVNZ at the moment is that if you want to keep a Māori news bulletin, that's fine, but you're going to have to put your money where your mouth is. You can afford to fund a 6 p.m. bulletin. You've been given, for example, this year it was $900,000 in kind that TVNZ contributed, but Te Māngai Pāho funded the rest of Te Karere. And so Te Māngai Pāho is saying we're not in a space to be able to do that anymore if you're going to keep producing Te Karere the way you are. So alongside this working group, they came up with the solution that would be regional hubs that would feed in a central news provider, and the likes of Te Karere or Te Ao on Whakaata Māori, they can all sort of source their stories from these regional providers, put it into a bulletin format if they want to. That choice is theirs. There is the caveat that Te Māngai Pāho put on the RFP, which was that these outlets would have to be able to prove that there was demand there if they wanted to produce something like that and get funded for it. Otherwise, the onus is on them to back it themselves. So that's the direction we seem to be heading in.
I mean, it does sound like a pretty good strategy if you are trying to make a step change to how you meet audiences. Before we get into that regional news thing, you and I are both students of the Where Are the Audiences research that New Zealand On Air has been doing for a decade now. Do you want to sort of top line what it tells us about Māori audiences, especially where there are sort of notable differences from that kind of all of population audience?
Yeah, so July last year, the first ever Where Are the Māori Audiences report came out. And it basically told us that Māori audiences are young, especially compared to...
yeah, I mean, you've got 2027 as the
median
average
age, yep.
versus 38, I think, for general population.
And they're all watching Netflix and YouTube, basically, which isn't a massive surprise for us, but...
I mean, that's younger audiences broadly,
yeah.
But still, to have it laid out there like that, it challenges the likes of New Zealand On Air and Te Māngai Pāho and everyone else down the chain.
A really interesting part of that I discovered, or that the study discovered, which it was that these audiences, the Māori audiences, have a preference for locally produced content, but where they're consuming that content, that locally produced content isn't necessarily there. So they have a preference for New Zealand-made programming, bilingual programming, but they're on Netflix and YouTube, which that content isn't really there. It's on demand on TVNZ Plus or Māori Plus.
It's effectively a distribution problem meeting a preference. That's where the issue comes. I mean, YouTube as a distribution platform feels very available to this. So, I mean, behind all this, and it's interesting, right? Because I think it's like 3 or 4 weeks ago, we did an appeal for audience funding to kind of fund Ātea and give you an editorial budget and so on, which, because essentially there hasn't been funding for the written word as a journalistic product versus audio and visual. Does that remain the case, that there is that sort of strong preference for those mediums, even as they shift into a digital first, theoretically more content agnostic mode?
A preference for the...
as Te Māngai Pāho moves into a digital space, does it retain that kind of broadcasting lineage effectively, i.e., even though there are lots of different content forms, including print, that you could rule in a way that it wasn't easy to do historically? Are they still very much in that kind of, we're going to fund audio and video over other forms?
Yeah, it definitely seems that way, though they are increasingly funding digital content creation as well. That pool seems to be growing quite significantly. But it appears that these regional hubs are really going to start eating up a majority of the funding available for news and current affairs, especially. And again, they'll be funding fluent content. There'll definitely be a preference for fluent content as well, scripted, non-scripted content that will be produced and uploaded to socials and digital as well. So it seems like this is really part of their shift away from funding linear first programming to funding content that serves a wider audience and is digital first in its approach.
Where does Whakaata Māori fit into all this? Because they're both a sort of, fundamentally at their core, or certainly were founded as a linear television network, so they could be looked at as kind of, a bit of an odd fit for this system, but they, I think that they've had some great success with particularly socially distributed content. Are they, how do they sort of fit into this new world that's being kind of built out?
When I used to work at Whakaata Māori back in the Newmarket days, basically the whole, I think it was called, there were the East Wing and the West Wing, and there was a whole wing that was basically dedicated to news and current affairs. Basically everyone on that side of the building, that's all they cared about. And I think over time we've slowly seen funding for news and current affairs at Whakaata Māori wither away, especially once they shifted to the Mount Wellington studios where they are now. And they've been pouring money into producing other types of content, dramas and all those, types of things, and funneling money away from news and current affairs, probably because they understand that that's not where linear audiences are. And you're right that they have had great success with their digital content, but they're not seeing that translate into eyeballs on their content necessarily. They're, like clicking through to their website or watching their shows.
Well, you're talking about longer form sort of programming on platform versus, anything that, social is the end point, not the gateway.
Yeah. And it's the problem that everyone in the industry is facing, right? Is how do you convert those clicks or that engagement on your content into eyeballs on your website or watching your actual shows that you're producing. So for Karere Māori, again, they're directly funded from the government too, so that continues to be a point of contention for those in the industry. Because of the numbers that Karere Māori is pulling on social media, they can lay claim to having great success there. But again, with that lack of conversion, it's really making people question, why is so much money getting poured into this platform that is, again, like you say, a linear first at its core broadcaster, and they're not really seeing arguably a great return on that investment at this point in time.
When you think about some of the genre programming, you're talking about the likes of drama and so on, that typically isn't stuff that you see performing well on social anyway. So if you're moving that direction from a commissioning perspective, well, you can understand it in terms of wanting to have a rounded programming output. If you just can't get people to come to a destination website, then the return on investment of that versus other things you might do is quite hard to justify potentially.
Yeah, and to be fair, it was a long time coming, but they launched the Māori Plus app, I think, I want to say within the last 12 months or not much longer than that. So that is a step in the right direction, but still, with the amount of money that is poured into Karere Māori compared to the amount of money that Te Māngai Pāho gets, there's a lot of contention there about where that money is best spent, and Te Māngai Pāho, their hands are tied. They used to distribute the money out to Karere Māori, but it was all ring-fenced anyway. And then the government basically decided to give them all the money. So yeah, they've stripped everything from news and current affairs. They've scaled that right back down. They had to lay off basically a bunch of staff earlier this year.
Because they shut they had a news bulletin which kind of got lost and as News Hub shut down and all the other TVNZ bulletins, but that was around the same time, right? That one went away as well. Yeah.
So basically, as I understand it now, they've just got a small digital first news team that produces some written stuff, a very small amount of video content. They don't do any audio first content at all. So yeah, they're pouring all their resources into producing this other content that they produce in-house or commission out, but we're not really seeing a great amount of people consuming that content.
So finally, talk about these kind of regional news hubs, because there's we've focused for the most part on what's being lost and kind of various reasons why, but what's sort of being built and how. Yeah, what's your sort of verdict on whether that's the sort of right approach in general?
Back in the day, if you're a young Māori journalist or someone interested in working in the industry, you had to work for TVNZ or RNZ, or these legacy media institutions and outlets. Now with these regional hubs, we're seeing people return to the regions, but we're also seeing young Māori people in the industry or entering the industry and being developed in their regions. They don't have to go to the big smoke, they can stay in the areas and be trained by these professionals that have had that experience.
But aren't sort of trapped in the mothership and with the kind of restrictions there. Are you also seeing kind of, because of that younger demographic and, like, the fact that there are like TikTok native kind of, people fluent in that approach to content creation, getting a journalism wrapper on that. So are you seeing a sort of new generation of Māori journalists who are coming through a system without going through that form of the system?
Yeah, definitely. Like you say, that they're so comfortable producing content like that because they've been doing it anyway. They haven't had to go to study journalism or comms at university or anything like that. They can basically enter the industry very organically and then be nurtured by people who have some knowledge in the industry and experience, come up in the industry like that. And that obviously is great for multiple reasons. Of course, it's also enabling them to best serve their communities in a very organic way that's true and that works for them. And the other thing that we're seeing also is a removal of the structures that we have in some of those legacy institutions where there's this hierarchy of editorial oversight and all those types of things. Whereas these people, these young Māori journalists and the likes, can enter the industry and sort of take control because it is so young. They can control things and shape it the way that they best see fit. There's a lot of collaboration in the way they approach these things. Whereas those of us who have come up through the big dogs, we understand that there's 8 different levels of editorial oversight before you can get a story out, which our audiences, these younger Māori audiences, are more cognizant of and are able to sort of decipher a story that has had a high level of editorial oversight compared to one that's very organic, like the video we saw with Eileen Tamati and her nephew recording in her kitchen, the morning of this big event happening. And it seems increasingly that the preference is for that more organic content instead of the more polished, refined product. There's still an audience there, but with these younger people, they seem to really enjoy the less filtered stuff. So,
I mean, that's a global kind of trend. That's known and acknowledged, that the sort of creator first in the, there's the sort of authenticity of it in a news context is, because it's so consonant with what else is going on TikTok and Reels and so on, that you can't put things into that realm that don't look like that. They just won't get any kind of pickup or distribution. Thanks so much, Liam, for coming on the fold today to talk this through. Super fascinating development, because it does feel like it's really the way the whole rest of the industry will ultimately have to go over time. And be interesting to see how it plays out. Yeah, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.